Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. When Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited France last week, he did something unique, something to my mind no previous Indian Prime Minister had done before. He visited one of the sites of World War I, Neuve-Chapelle to be precise, and laid a wreath at the monument commemorating the death of Indian soldiers. 74,000 Indian troops laid down their lives during World War I. Europe and the world is in the midst of commemorating the 100th anniversary of this bloody war, described at the time as the Great War or the war to end all wars. Joining me this evening is Professor Margaret MacMillan, eminent historian, professor of history at Oxford University, author of the seminal book, The War That Ended Peace, perhaps one of the most important books to come out on the history or historiography of World War I. Thank you for joining us this evening.
I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you for asking me.
I know that you want to avoid the fundamental question, the question everybody wants to know, summarized in one line, and I'm not going to ask you that. I think the subtitle of your book, How Europe Abandoned Peace for the First World War, in a way captures the complexity of the origins of this war. There was no one cause.
No, there really wasn't. And I think when we try and find one cause, we're engaged on a futile effort. I think there were so many reasons why Europe could have either stayed at peace or gone to war. And I think we have to think of Europe and the world as really being in play in this period before 1914, where there were strong forces for peace, a great many people thinking the world was now so interconnected because this was a great age of globalization that war was unthinkable, increasingly unthinkable, especially in Europe, which was the most prosperous and advanced part of the world. And there were also forces for war. There were the nationalist fervors, which so sadly have distorted so much and destroyed so much of Europe in the 20th century. There was imperialism, the scramble to gain parts of the world by European empires. There was militarism, the building up of big armies. And so I see Europe as a continent that could have gone down either road. And unfortunately for Europe and for the world, it went down the road of war. But going down that road, there was a lot of accident, a lot of bad decisions. I don't think it had to happen, but in the end it did. And we all, different countries around the world, including my own country, Canada, paid a price for that.
You make an important point in the book and also in various interviews you've given that the war wasn't inevitable, that you had a multiplicity of factors, as you mentioned, structural reasons, precise or specific conflicts in different parts of the world that pitted, say, France and the UK against Germany, which was a rising power. And yet, a series of miscalculations by individual leaders, and then you have a situation where this war breaks out.
Yeah. Well, and you have the role of accident. I mean, I think if the heir to the Austrian throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, if his driver had not taken the wrong turning in Sarajevo on June the 28th, 1914, the assassins who were trying to kill him wouldn't have been able to do so. And that meant that Austria-Hungary now had the opportunity it had been looking for to try and destroy Serbia. And that in turn triggered Germany supporting Austria-Hungary, Russia supporting Serbia, and then the other powers came in. So that accident, I think, actually was hugely important. But you also have individuals, and many of them, like us all, with their flaws and their strengths. But you had in Germany a Kaiser who talked too much. He was bombastic. He talked about war. He I think, found himself by 1914 in a position where he had to appear as a war leader. He had backed down on previous occasions. He knew his own army were muttering about him and saying he was a coward. So he was under psychological pressure, and unfortunately had a great deal of power. The same thing with the Tsar of Russia, a man who was actually a decent family man, not a bad man, but rather weak. And he was under huge pressure to show that Russia was still a power. And so I think what you have to do when you're trying to understand the origins of the First World War is look both at the big factors, as you say, the forces, the structural factors. I mean, these are all important. But I think you also have to look at what actually happens in the summer of 1914 when you suddenly get not that many people, just a few men in each country making decisions which can take Europe to war or not. Somebody had to sign the paper that took Europe to war in each country, took each country to war. And so what I tried to do in my book, it's like, I always think like playing chess on three different chessboards which are connected. I tried to look at the structural factors. I tried to look at the way people were thinking. What was it that made certain decision makers think that war was an option in 1914? Why did they think they could win it? But I also looked at the complicated and often deeply flawed human beings who in the end had to say yes or no. So I tried to balance all three. But The trouble with the origins of the First World War is we will always argue about it. What we do know is that it was a war that they hadn't really expected. It was a war that dragged on. It pulled in resources and, of course, men from around the world. And that's what really makes it a world war, that so many men moved from India, from my own country, Canada, from Australia, New Zealand, Morocco, Algeria, Vietnam, drawn into this dreadful conflict.
Your book starts with this very evocative description of the Paris exhibition, this grand world fair where countries showcased what they thought were their sort of best products. Yeah. And I think that underlines a fundamental point that, contrary to popular belief or maybe some analysts, that the lack of connectedness or the lack of globalization, the lack of one country having an economic stake in the growth and prosperity of the other, the world and Europe at that time was very connected.
Yeah. The period before 1914 was as great an age of globalization as our own time was. And this was a period where trade grew enormously among different countries, investment grew enormously. I mean, the railways in South America, United States and Canada were built with money from Europe, mainly from England. Germany and Britain were each other's biggest trading partners, which is curious because you always think if countries trade with each other, they'll see that there's no point going to war. You also had, before the First World War, huge movements of people around the world. I mean, Indians were moving out around the world. They were moving to places such as Canada, Fiji, Latin America, Australia, and lots of Europeans, again, were moving. So it did seem like the world was so interconnected that it wouldn't make sense to have a war. And a lot of people argued this before the First World War. They said there's no point in a war because we'll all suffer. But that doesn't stop, unfortunately, human nature from getting into war.
But of course, the fundamental structural factor, which we can understand in the context of today's international relations, the conflict between an established global power and a rising power. Germany obviously feeling the lack of space, wanting to take on Britain and France. German historians have argued, the so-called Fischer thesis, that even if the Archduke wasn't assassinated, Germany would have found a way to go to war. But you contest that.
Well, I think I do contest it because, yes, there were pressures in Germany and there were those who said, look, we're encircled. I mean, perceptions are so important in international relations. Germany was the biggest country in the center of Europe. It was the greatest economic power. It had the biggest army. But a lot of Germans felt themselves under threat because they looked at the map and they saw France on one side and Russia on the other side. And so they felt threatened. I mean, for Germany...
15 years before, you have the Schlieffen Plan.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, crazily to my mind, presented as a defensive plan, which involves invading France and Belgium.
Yeah. I mean, Germany felt we're going to have to fight. France and Russia have an alliance. They're sooner or later going to attack us. And they had this plan, which I agree was probably unworkable, where they would dash into France, knock France out in 6 weeks, and then move all those troops over to the east to deal with Russia. They'd fight just a little holding action against Russia. But, you know, if you look at it, I mean, there were other routes for Germany, as there have been today. You look at the Germany of today, which is the great economic powerhouse of Europe, but it's thoroughly enmeshed in European politics. It gets on well with its neighbors. It could have gone the other way. And there were people in Germany, there was a big German industrialist who said in 1914, he said, they're all crazy in Berlin, the capital of Germany. They're all crazy because they're talking about war. If we wait, economically, we're going to get it anyway. But it's perception, it's fear. I think these things matter a lot in international relations.
Joseph Nye has spoken about, apart from what you've said, the rise, sort of the contest between status quo and established powers, the rigidity of the alliance system. I mean, there was a sense in which the flexibility or the fluidity of alliances which Europe had seen over the last 50 or 60 years before World War I had gotten more rigid, more ossified. Well, to what extent do you see that as driving war, finally, one of the main factors?
I think less than Joseph Nye, whom I respect enormously, but on this one I would disagree with him, because the alliance systems were actually more fluid than they appeared. I mean, later on after the war, everyone said it was those crazy alliance systems which were like a chain reaction. You know, once two countries got involved, everyone else got pulled.
I mean, Austria declares war, so Germany joins in, and Russia comes for Serbia.
But
Britain and France.
But the only actual firm alliances were defensive alliances. And so France and Russia said to each other, if either of us is attacked by a third party, we'll come to your support. So it had to be defensive. And Britain had no alliance with anyone. It had understandings.
With Belgium, didn't it?
No, well, yes. With Belgium, Britain had, like a lot of other European powers, including Germany, had guaranteed Belgian neutrality. So that was a guarantee. But as far as Britain having to come in to defend France, no. or defend Russia, no. And even with Austria-Hungary, Germany had to decide it was going to support Austria-Hungary because Austria-Hungary was picking a quarrel with Serbia. So the alliance wouldn't have operated. But in this case, Germany said, we give you a blank check. Do what you want. We're going to support you. You know, and the other thing about alliances is if you don't live up to the terms of your alliance, who does anything to you? I mean, there's no international court which will say, okay, you're at fault. Italy was allied to Germany and Austria-Hungary. It ended up joining the other side. Right. So I think the alliances were actually much looser.
Okay. Right. I mean, one could, in a way, take that argument and perhaps make look at the way in which current international politics is unfolding with U.S.-China. But one of the issues that you raise, which I've never seen addressed before, the role of public opinion in driving leaders into war, taking hardened positions. To what? Tell us something about that, because I mean we're used to public opinion playing an important role today with internet, Twitter, instant communication. Given the state of communications and the media at that stage, to what extent? I mean, how did public opinion exert its influence?
Well, public opinion was increasingly important, partly because more people could read and write, and so they were literate, and more people were living in cities, so you had greater masses of people together. And you had, in this period, mass media, in particular newspapers. This was just the beginning of film, and you didn't yet have radio. But the newspapers had huge circulations, and the biggest daily in Moscow in 1914 had a circulation of 800,000, which is pretty big. So the public were much better informed. Also, they had a say in two ways. First, through lobbies. There were very strong lobbies for colonies, for navies, for armies, whatever, in different countries, but also through politics. More and more countries were allowing more and more people to vote, particularly men. And so politicians had to worry about the next election. And so they have to pay attention to public opinion. Even in Russia, which is still an autocracy, there is now a parliament. And the Tsar actually complains before 1914. He said, I have to pay attention to this thing called public opinion. Public opinion, of course, is changeable. And so while some of the public were for peace, there were a lot of people who were sort of pushing for more colonies, more navies, more ships, more armies. And so it really is now a factor.
To what extent would internal instability or the fear of instability, I mean, we're talking of regimes which, had introduced adult franchise in a limited sort of way. Women couldn't vote in the UK. Right. But, you have the rise of social democracy, trade union movements, a whole host of challenges to the old order. Yeah. To what extent was the fear of internal uncertainty and conflict a driving force, a structural driving force for the leaders in deciding, okay, fine, maybe war is the answer to our problems?
Yeah. Well, that's an absolutely vital question, and I'm glad you asked it. I think it is a factor. I mean, I think what you have in most European societies is a tension between those who came from the old ruling classes, many of them upper class with titles, whose family wealth depended on owning agricultural land, and they were under pressure. They were under pressure from a rising middle class, who were often better educated and smarter. They were also under pressure because the price of agricultural goods was going down, so the land wasn't worth as much. And a lot of them wanted to try and hold on. And a lot of them disliked what was happening. They disliked the rise of socialism. They disliked the rise of unions. They disliked things like an active middle class talking about free speech and rights and so on. And so in a number of countries, Germany is one key example, you had the old ruling classes saying, if we had a good war, we could get rid of all this annoying stuff. We could dissolve the unions, ban the parliament, get rid of the constitution. We could go back to the way things were. And so a lot of German historians have talked about a flight forward, fleeing their own internal complications and hoping that a war will settle everything.
Lenin may have simplified things when he spoke about the war, World War I as a product of imperialism or the highest stage of capitalism, conflict between monopolies. But on one issue he was right, or one description, when he spoke about how World War I had accelerated the process of revolutionary change. I know this is taking us away from the causes of World War I, but you've written about the consequences too. The end of World War I led to dramatic changes internally, externally.
I mean, the war itself put a terrible strain on any society involved in fighting on it. I mean, not just the hideous losses. I mean, we think that 9 million men died in that war. I mean, it's hard to imagine what that must have meant for society. But tremendous economic strain, tremendous social strain. Countries had to really mobilize all their resources.
And they were all men because cities weren't bombed.
The First World War was a war in which far more men got killed than women. The Second World War was going to be very different. But a number of civilians did die if they happened to be unfortunate enough to be in the zones or died of disease and starvation as a result of the war. But no, it was the men who disproportionately bore the brunt of the losses. But the strains on society were too much for some societies. I mean, Britain and France came through, although they had wobbles. Italy came through, but was deeply damaged, and I think that helped to speed the rise of Mussolini and the fascists. And in Russia, the old order simply collapsed. As far as Lenin is concerned, I don't think he and the Bolsheviks would ever have got into power without the First World War. I mean, they were a tiny minority fringe group. He was in exile. It was the war that gave them their opportunity, and the world's never been the same.
Right. I want to shift focus a little bit. You have described, or you've asked the question in your book after describing some of the terrible scenes of destruction in Europe. How could Europe do this to itself? Yeah. Sitting here in India, we may have a more simple answer. We never saw the scale of that destruction during colonialism, but you know, colonialism was a pretty brutal power in the countries that it occupied. To what extent was, I mean, obviously structurally, the race for colonies, competition among imperial powers is important, but to what extent did the dehumanization that colonialism introduced in military bureaucracies in the colonial powers also contribute to the way in which the war was fought?
It's a very interesting question, and I don't know if it's been properly explored. I mean, I think the fact that so many European imperialists regarded the peoples over whom they ruled as somehow less human than themselves and worth less than themselves, and that they were so prepared to use brutality against them. I mean, you think of Kitchener in the Sudan simply mowing down with machine guns 10,000 of the Mahdi's troops, or you think of the ways in which you know, the British behaved in Afghanistan. I think there was, and there's been a very...
Oh, the Belgians in Congo, although they weren't a belligerent.
No, the Belgians of the Congo, without the doubt, I think the worst story of all. But there is some interesting work being done on the Germans in Southwest Africa, and an argument that the brutality that the Germans got used to there actually fed back into the ways in which they treated people in Europe. And what you got during the First World War was Europeans doing things to each other which they had previously done to other peoples around the world, which they thought they weren't going to do, but of course they did.
Could France and the UK have been more accommodating? I mean, it does seem, if you review events leading up to World War I, I mean, the astonishing fact that I think a month or two before the war breaks out, you have British warships visiting Kiel. Yeah. If they were willing to do that kind of thing, could they have taken steps or measures? Could they have read Germany better, accommodated Germany here and there in order to ensure this war didn't break out?
I think they could have done, and I think, in fact, there were attempts to do that. I mean, you know, there were statesmen who recognized that the tensions were getting too high and that it was getting too dangerous. And the British and the Germans were actually talking almost up to the eve of the war about trying to come to an accommodation. Basically, the British had won the naval race against Germany, which was something that had really driven Britain apart from Germany. By 1914, that had more or less been...
a settled question.
It was a settled question. And the British were talking to the Germans about giving them some colonies in Africa, which the Germans very badly wanted. The British, with true cynicism, I think, were going to give Portugal's colonies to Germany. And Portugal may have been Britain's oldest ally, but when it came down to realpolitik, it didn't matter. So I think, yes, I think there could have been accommodations. But when the crisis happened, I mean, in a way, what you get is the rigidity of the military plans. If Germany had been able to go to war just against Russia, you mentioned earlier the Schlieffen Plan, the famous German plan. If the Germans had had a plan which said, we're just going to fight Russia, we won't attack France, things might have been different. But the plan was the only plan they had, and it was rigid. And so they had to attack France. And the Kaiser, when he realized this, said, all right, well, go ahead, what can I do? Which was a real abdication of responsibility. But once the Germans say to the French, we're moving in, what can the French do? You know, they have no choice but to fight. And that's when, of course, it becomes very important for the British to decide what they're going to do.
I know you've stayed away from chronicling the contours or the course of the war. Yeah. But at what point did it dawn on Europe's leaders that this was not just another Balkan war? This was not a conflict that would peter out in 6 months, notwithstanding the Christmas truce that we saw at the end of 1914.
Yeah. I think they were beginning to realize it in the first few months of the war. They were beginning to realize, and so were the military, that this was a war on a scale which they hadn't really expected, and losses on a scale they hadn't expected. Some of the worst losses in terms of men dying were actually in the first few months of that war. And it's very interesting. A number of the top generals basically had nervous breakdowns and had to be removed. I think the pressures, and they suddenly recognized what they were in for. But human nature being what it is, I think two things kept them going. One, that they kept on hoping they'd win. And so at the end of 1914, both sides said, well, we'll settle in for the winter, and then we'll have a big push in the spring, and then it will all be settled. And then when it didn't happen in 1915, they said, well, we'll wait for 1916, and then we'll wait for 1917, and so on. You know, and the Allies were planning to fight on into 1919, and so were the Germans. So I think there was this pressure to win. And I think the second thing was that once you have losses on this scale, it's very difficult to get out. I mean, how do you turn around and say to your publics and to your colleagues, look, we made a mistake here. Yes, we've lost 500,000 men, but sorry, we made a mistake. We're going to stop now. Nobody will get anything out of it. You know, politically, it was very, very difficult to do. And so I think there was a dawning realization that they were in for something awful. But the question then was, how do you get out of it? That's the awful thing about wars. They have their own logic, and they just drag you along, and it's very hard to get out.
We're in the midst of a European and global commemoration of the war. And I have to ask you this. The question of justness. If you look at World War II, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that this was a just war. The kids who fought and died knew what they would fight for, at least on the Allied side, and the Germans and the Japanese now realize. You can't say the same thing about World War I.
Well, you could have...
And yet you have to commemorate the death of those young men.
Yeah. You could have said it at the time, interestingly enough, because during the war, both sides tended to think they were fighting for something important. European governments were very successful in portraying the war as a defensive war, a war that we have to defend our way of life. Right. And so the Germans felt they were fighting to save German civilization. The British felt the same, and the Russians. It was only after the war that doubts came in. And I think we are right to doubt the justness of that war. On the other hand, I think what we need to remember is the men who died. And I think we need to do it, in my view, in a non-nationalistic way. I think we need to see it as a catastrophe which simply hit the world. And we can go on debating if it should have happened. But I think what we need to do now is think of those who died.
Has the tone and tenor of the commemorations you've seen so far been appropriate? I mean, there is still a tendency, I'm not familiar with France, but certainly in the Anglo-American literature, to telescope the justness of World War II back onto World War I.
There is, I think, and there has been, I think, too much nationalistic commemoration. But what I think is important is when you get these things that are crossing lines. I mean, there's going to be a commemoration next week, this coming week, in Gallipoli, where the Turks and the Australians and the British and the French are going to be there together.
I think the Indians too.
Yeah. I'm so sorry. Of course the Indians, yes, because you were hugely important there. So all the countries who had peoples there are going to be there commemorating it, and I think that's very important. I mean, I think that's the way we should be remembering it. And I think we also need, quite frankly, to look at the Second World War with a bit of skepticism. Yes, it was a just war. On the other hand, we were allied with one of the most dreadful dictatorships in the form of Stalin's Soviet Union. So we did dreadful things, you know, so it's not entirely clear-cut. I think we have to recognize that war is a horrible and messy business, and it's never entirely just and never entirely in black and white.
In India, there's been a great deal of ambivalence about World War I. Yeah. 74,000 Indian soldiers died essentially for a colonial war, a war that wasn't ours. And there's always been this tension between commemorating the sacrifice and bravery of these men who died in faraway lands with somehow buying into some of the theories and explanations of war. I remember when I happened to visit Iraq in 98 or 99, before the war, and I visited, along with the Indian ambassador, the graveyard, the massive graveyard in Basra, and the caretaker brought me these sacks of volumes with thousands and thousands of Indian names, young kids from present-day Tamil Nadu or Uttarakhand who died there. The feeling in India, I suppose, is never again will we fight, should we fight for somebody else's war? But how do you think a country like India, which was dragged into this, ought to commemorate an occasion like this?
Well, I think with calmness and reflection, and you're right, India was dragged in, and my own country, Canada, was dragged in too. I mean, the British basically declared war on behalf of their empire, but in the case of Canada, there were so many people of recent British descent, recent immigrants of British descent, that in a way that I think it made more sense for Canada to come into the war than it did for India. And I think for India and other countries such as Canada, Australia to commemorate it, I think we have to remember that they thought they were doing their duty. They were very brave. They were lost, and I think that's what we need to remember. And I think some of the best work that has been done on India in the war has been an attempt to recover the voices of those Indian soldiers and to quote their letters.
That's right, exactly. Professor MacMillan, you have written about the causes of World War I, you've written about Versailles. What's next on your agenda?
Well, I don't know. I think I'm going to do a short book at the moment, because I tend to do very fat books. And that
well, they're very readable, though.
Oh, you're very kind. I try. That's because I think history is so important that it should be written in ways that anyone who wants to find out can read it. So I try very hard to do that. But I'm doing a short book at the moment, which I've nearly finished, on the role of personalities and people in history. So what sort of difference do they make, and why are we interested in them? And one of the Indian people I'm going to do is Akbar. Sorry, not Akbar. I was going to do Akbar. I'm doing Babur because I find him so interesting. He wrote such a wonderful memoir.
That's right, the Babarnama.
Yeah.
Well, we look forward to reading that book. I'm sure it'll be wonderful, like all your other work.
That's very kind.
Thank you so much for joining us on Rajya Sabha TV.
Well, thank you for such nice questions.
And do keep watching Rajya Sabha TV, and of course join us next week for another guest on Indian Standard Time. Thank you.